The drums stopped first. That's how you knew. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, in the year we would call 1492, silence was the cruelest sound. The plaza, normally alive with merchants, priests, and the laughter of children, went still. Every head turned toward the stone platform at the city's center. Every breath held. A woman stood there, hands bound, eyes forward. She wore no ornament, no feather, no jade. The disgrace was already written on her skin. And then the voice of the law. It cut through the morning air like obsidian through flesh. Sure, final, irreversible. By the order of the Teletoni, by the word of the gods, by the ancient laws written in blood and fire, this woman has violated the sacred bond. She has brought chaos into order. She has invited darkness into light. The sentence is death. But first, she must understand what death truly means. The crowd did not gasp. They knew this ritual. They had seen it before. What they were about to witness wasn't just punishment. It was cosmology made flesh. Welcome to the Aztec Empire, where infidelity wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a tear in the fabric of reality itself. A cosmic crime that demanded cosmic retribution. And what they did to unfaithful wives, what they truly did, was engineer a fate so horrifying that the body's destruction was merely the beginning. This is that story. The Aztec worldview was not like ours. They did not see the universe as stable, permanent, or guaranteed. They believed they lived in the fifth sun, the fifth attempt by the gods to create a functioning world. 4 times before, creation had failed. 4 times the sun had died, and with it all of humanity. The fifth sun was fragile, hungry, desperate. It required constant feeding, constant maintenance, constant sacrifice. Everything, from the rising of the sun to the growth of maize to the birth of children, depended on a delicate balance between order and chaos. The Aztecs called this balance Nepantla, the in-between place, the razor's edge between existence and void. And social order was part of that balance. The family unit was not just a domestic arrangement. It was a reflection of divine architecture. The husband represented Tonatiuh, the sun god. The wife represented the earth, fertile and receptive. Their union was a microcosm of the universe itself. When that union was violated, when a wife took another man into her bed, it wasn't just adultery. It was cosmological sabotage. The legal code of the Aztecs was called the Texcacana. Brutal, precise, unforgiving. It was compiled by the philosopher King Nezahualcóyotl in the early 15th century, and it governed every aspect of life in the empire. Theft, murder, drunkenness, infidelity. For infidelity there was no gray area, no plea bargaining, no mercy. The law stated it clearly: any woman caught in the act of adultery would be executed. And not quietly, not privately, but publicly, ceremonially, with the full weight of religious authority behind it. Because this wasn't just about punishment, it was about restoration. The universe demanded blood to repair the tear she had created. But how did they know? How did suspicion become certainty? How did a woman move from wife to criminal in the eyes of the state? The answer is as disturbing as the punishment itself. Aztec society was a surveillance state. Not through technology but through social architecture. The Calpulli system, neighborhood councils that governed every block of Tenochtitlan, meant that everyone was watching everyone. Neighbors reported neighbors. Servants whispered to masters. Children informed on parents. Privacy was a foreign concept. If a woman was suspected of infidelity, the machinery of justice moved quickly, quietly, lethally. First came the whispers. Perhaps a neighbor noticed her husband leaving for the market, and another man entering shortly after. Perhaps a servant saw a gift, flowers, cacao, a woven bracelet, that did not come from her spouse. Perhaps a child mentioned a name that didn't belong. The whispers reached the Calpulli leaders. They began their investigation. They watched her home. They questioned her servants. They followed her through the market, through the temple courtyards, through the narrow streets that twisted like veins through the city. And if they found evidence, if they caught her in the act, or if witnesses came forward with testimony, they brought her before the judges. The judges were not men of compassion. They were men of the law, stone-faced, obsidian-eyed. They sat in the hall of justice, surrounded by glyphs that spelled out every crime and every punishment in blood-red paint. The woman was brought before them, bound at the wrists, stripped of her jewelry, her status, her identity. She was allowed to speak, to defend herself. But the system was not designed for acquittal. If caught in the act, if witnesses testified, if evidence was presented, the verdict was already written. The judges did not deliberate. They consulted the codices, the ancient law books painted on bark paper and deerskin. They found the passage. They read it aloud. And then they pronounced the sentence. Stoning. Strangulation. Death. But the trial itself was part of the torture. Because she knew what was coming. Every woman in the empire knew what was coming. They had all seen it. They had all stood in the plaza and watched as another woman, a neighbor, a sister, a stranger, was dragged to the stone platform and broken apart like pottery. The psychological terror began the moment the accusation was made. She would lie awake at night, listening to her husband's breathing, wondering if he knew, wondering if he suspected, wondering if this was the night the Kalpuli leaders would knock on her door. And when they came, when they bound her hands and led her through the streets, the terror crystallized into something primal. She was no longer a person. She was a symbol. A lesson written in flesh. The execution was not swift. The Aztecs understood that punishment must be witnessed to be effective. It must be communal. It must be participatory. So they gathered the city. The drums began again. Slow. Steady. The heartbeat of the empire. The woman was brought to the platform. The same platform where sacrifices to the gods were made. The same platform where warriors were honored and kings crowned. But today it was a stage for disgrace. The method varied, but the most common was stoning. She was placed in the center of the plaza. Her hands were unbound, not as a mercy, but so she could feel every moment, raise them in futile defense, beg for a forgiveness that would not come. The priest spoke first. He invoked Tenochtitlan, the goddess of filth and purification. He explained to the crowd that this woman had introduced chaos into order, that her body was now corrupted, that her soul was stained. And then he invited the community to participate. One by one, the citizens of Tenochtitlan picked up stones. Not large ones. The Aztecs were not crude. They understood that death must be prolonged to be meaningful. Small stones, fist-sized, heavy enough to bruise, to break, but not to kill quickly. They formed a circle around her. And they began. The first stone struck her shoulder. She flinched, stumbled, tried to cover her face with her hands. The second struck her back. The third her ribs. And then the rhythm began. Stone after stone. A percussion of judgment. A staccato drumbeat of flesh and rock. She tried to run, to escape the circle. But there was nowhere to go. The crowd was too thick. The stones too many. Her skin split. Blood ran down her arms, her legs pooled at her feet. She screamed, begged, called out to gods who had already turned their faces away. The crowd did not hesitate, did not waver, because this was not cruelty. This was duty. Every stone thrown was a prayer. Every impact was a restoration of balance. Every bruise was a stitch in the cosmic fabric she had torn. Children watched. They were meant to watch. This was education. This was how they learned what happened when order was violated. The stoning continued until she could no longer stand. Until her body was a mosaic of purple and red and black. Until her breathing came in wet, ragged gasps. And then, finally, a priest approached with a cord. Maguey fiber. Rough. Strong. He wrapped it around her neck. And he pulled. Strangulation was not quick. The Aztecs knew anatomy. They knew how to make it last. The cord tightened slowly. Her hands clawed at her throat. Her eyes bulged. Her tongue protruded. The crowd watched in silence, because this was the moment of transition. The moment when the body gave way to the spirit. The moment when the real punishment began. You see, the Aztecs believed in multiple afterlives. Not one heaven, not one hell, but different destinations based on how you died. Warriors who died in battle went to the house of the sun, where they spent their days in eternal glory, escorting Tenochtitlan across the sky. Women who died in childbirth went to the same place, honored as warriors themselves, for they had fought and died bringing life into the world. People who drowned or were struck by lightning or died of certain diseases went to Tlalocan, the paradise of the rain god, a place of eternal spring and abundance. But those who died of disgrace, those who were executed for crimes against the cosmic order, they went nowhere. Or worse, they went to Mictlan. Mictlan was not a place of fire and brimstone. It was colder than that, emptier than that. It was a void. A 9-level underworld where souls wandered in darkness for 4 years, enduring trials designed to strip away every shred of identity, memory, and self. They crossed rivers of blood, climbed mountains of obsidian, walked through winds so sharp it flayed the spirit. And at the end of the 4 years they reached the 9th level where Tenochtitlan, the Lord of the Dead, waited. And he devoured them. Not their bodies. Those were already gone. But their essence, their soul, their very existence. They were erased, unmade, returned to the primordial void from which they came. For an Aztec woman, this was the ultimate horror. Because the Aztecs did not believe in redemption. They did not believe in second chances. They did not believe that a soul could be cleansed or forgiven. Once stained, you were stained forever. Once disgraced, you were disgraced for all eternity. The woman who died in the plaza, stones breaking her bones and a cord crushing her throat, knew that her suffering was just beginning. She knew that her spirit would descend into Mictlan. She knew that she would wander in darkness. She knew that she would be forgotten. Because the Aztecs had one more punishment waiting for her. After her body was finally still, after the priest confirmed her death, her corpse was not given a proper burial. It was not cremated with honors. It was not placed in a tomb with offerings for the journey. Instead, it was dragged outside the city, dumped in a ravine, left for the dogs and the vultures. Her family was forbidden to mourn her, forbidden to speak her name, forbidden to make offerings to her spirit. She was erased from memory, from history, from existence itself. The Aztecs called this Tlazalmaquistli, the death of filth, and it was considered far worse than any physical torture, because it meant oblivion. Now here is where the story becomes even darker. The law was not equal. Men could commit adultery, and often they did, but the punishment for men was different, softer, more forgiving. If a man was caught with a married woman, he could be executed, but only if her husband demanded it. And even then the execution was swift, efficient, a blow to the head, a quick thrust of the knife, no stoning, no public spectacle, no erasure. And if the woman he slept with was unmarried or a courtesan or a slave, no punishment at all. Because in the Aztec worldview, a man's infidelity did not threaten the cosmic order. Only a woman's did. The reasoning was theological. Women were considered the guardians of lineage, of legitimacy, of blood purity. If a woman committed adultery, the paternity of her children was in question. The family line was corrupted. The entire Kalpuli was tainted. A man's adultery, by contrast, did not threaten lineage. His wife's children were still his. His family line was still pure. So the law focused its fury on women. It held them to a standard of perfection that men were never expected to meet. And when they failed, when they were accused, tried, and convicted, the punishment was designed not just to kill them but to obliterate them, to make them an example, a cautionary tale, a ghost story told to little girls in the firelight. There are accounts, preserved in the codices, recorded by Spanish priests who arrived after the conquest, of specific cases. One tells the story of a woman named Xochitl. She was the wife of a merchant, wealthy, respected. She had 3 children. But her husband traveled frequently and she was lonely. She took a lover, a young warrior. They met in secret in a small house at the edge of the city. A neighbor saw them, reported them to the Calpuli. Within a week they were both arrested. The warrior was taken to the temple. His head was placed on a stone block. A single blow of the macuahuitl, the obsidian-bladed club, ended his life. Xochitl was taken to the plaza. The account describes her execution in detail. Too much detail. It describes how the first stone struck her face, how her nose broke, how blood filled her mouth. It describes how she fell to her knees and begged for her children, how the crowd continued throwing stones, how she lost consciousness but was revived so the punishment could continue, how finally the cord was wrapped around her neck and pulled tight, and how her body was dragged through the streets as a warning before being thrown into the ravine outside the city. Her children were given to another family. They were told never to speak her name again. Xochitl became a ghost, a cautionary tale. A woman whose name was only whispered when teaching daughters the cost of disobedience. The Aztecs documented everything. They painted their history on bark paper and deerskin. They carved it into stone. And they passed it down through oral tradition, through songs and stories and warnings. But when the Spanish arrived in 1519, much of that documentation was destroyed. The conquistadors burned the codices, toppled the temples, melted down the gold. They called it civilization. But some records survived, hidden in caves, buried in tombs, preserved by priests who saw value in the old ways, even as they imposed the new. And what those records show is a society obsessed with order, with purity, with control. The laws regarding adultery were not unique. The Aztecs had equally brutal punishments for theft, for drunkenness, for disrespect toward the gods. But the focus on women, the specific gendered fury directed at female sexuality, reveals something deeper. It reveals a fear. A primordial fear that women, if left unchecked, had the power to unravel everything, to bring chaos, to destroy the fragile fifth sun and plunge the world back into darkness. So they controlled women with law, with violence, with terror. And they called it justice. Today, if you visit the ruins of Tenochtitlan, what is now Mexico City, you can still see the stones, the platforms where the executions took place, the plaza where the crowds gathered, the temples where the priests invoked the gods. The stones don't speak, but they remember. They remember the drumbeats, the screams, the silence that followed. They remember the women whose names were erased, whose bodies were broken, whose souls were cast into the void. And if you stand there long enough in the center of the plaza, you can almost hear it. The sound of stones striking flesh. The sound of a cord tightening around a throat. The sound of a civilization that believed order was worth any price. Even the price of mercy. Even the price of humanity. Even the price of justice itself. The Aztecs are gone now. Their empire fell in 1521, conquered by Spanish steel and European disease. But their laws remain, etched into the ruins, preserved in the codices, whispered in the stories. And they remind us of something we often forget. That civilization is not the same as compassion. That law is not the same as justice. That order, when pursued without mercy, becomes indistinguishable from cruelty. The women who died in those plazas, stoned, strangled, erased, were not monsters. They were human beings. Flawed, complex, caught in a system that valued cosmic balance over individual life. And their punishment was not designed to rehabilitate or reform. It was designed to terrify, to control, to remind every woman in the empire that her body, her choices, her very soul belonged to the state. That is what the Aztecs did to unfaithful wives. They didn't just kill them. They unmade them. They turned them into cautionary tales. into ghosts, into absences, and that, more than any stone or cord or blade, was the true punishment. Not death, but erasure, the void, the silence, the forgotten name. And it worked. For centuries it worked, until the stones themselves began to crumble, until the empire fell, until the only thing left was the memory. And the question we must ask ourselves now, standing in the shadow of those ruins, is this: how many of our own laws are built on the same foundation? How many of our own systems value order over mercy? How many of our own punishments are designed not to reform but to erase? The Aztecs believed they were maintaining the fifth sun, that their laws, their violence, their sacrifices were necessary to keep the universe from collapsing into darkness. But the sun rose the day after their empire fell, and it continues to rise, every morning, without their blood, without their stones, without their fear. The plaza is quiet now. The drums are silent. The gods have moved on. But the stones remain, and they remember everything.